Into the pub. A step back in time. What if I told you that stepping into a British pub in the 1960s or 70s wasn't just about grabbing a pint? It was stepping into a living, breathing world of culture, ritual, and unspoken codes. Imagine this. The door swings open with a familiar creak, and you're hit with a wave of sound. Muffled laughter, clinking pint glasses, the thump of darts hitting cork, and somewhere in the background, a jukebox humming a tune you half recognize but can't quite name. The air, dense, not just with smoke, but with stories. Each table, each stool, carried a regular. The bartender didn't just serve, he knew. He knew who'd order bitter, who'd risk a stout, and who just wanted the usual. Behind him, row after row of taps and bottles, some local legends, others national icons. A few divisive, some flat out infamous. Back then, a pint wasn't just a drink. It was a statement of who you were, where you came from, what kind of night you were looking for. And that's where this story begins. Over the next chapters, we're not just listing beers, we're revisiting the identity of an entire generation. Through 15 iconic pints that didn't just quench thirst, but fueled conversations, football debates, pub romances, and blurry karaoke renditions no one asked for. This was an era before flavor notes were printed on labels, before craft beer menus and Instagrammable foam. These were working-class drinks for working-class nights, sometimes brilliant, sometimes awful, but always memorable. So why revisit these now? Because memory has a funny way of aging things. Some of these brews are long gone. Some still linger in supermarkets, stripped of the soul they once had. And some, well, they only live on in pub legends and in stories like this. And trust me, some of these pints will make you nostalgic. Others will make you grateful they're extinct. But all of them? Worth remembering. If you're enjoying this nostalgic dive into pub culture, consider subscribing. We've got more stories coming, not just about beer, but about the people, places, and pint-sized moments that built an era. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a round. And now, shall we start in Leeds with a pint that didn't need to be introduced? You didn't ask what was on, you just knew. Tetley's Bitter, but that's only the beginning. The Northern Legends, bitters, banter, and belonging. If the pub was the church of the working class, then in Northern England, Tetley's was its holy water. There was something unspoken about walking into a pub in Leeds in the 70s. You didn't need to ask what was on tap. Tetley's was there, on the beer mats, on the stained glass windows, in the wooden casks behind the bar that creaked when rolled out. Its presence wasn't advertised, it was assumed, like the smell of smoke or the sound of a pint being pulled. The beer itself, earthy, slightly nutty, with a bitterness that clung to the back of your throat like a punchline told too many times. It divided opinion, but like family, it wasn't something you got to pick. You grew up with Tetley's. You either loved it or learned to. Talk to 10 Yorkshire lads about it, and you'll get 10 different stories. One remembers his dad's first pint. Another recalls it being poured at a wedding or a funeral. It wasn't about the quality of the beer. It was the ritual, the context, the way it anchored life. But just across the Pennines in Manchester, a different legend was being poured. One that came with a head as creamy as the pride behind it. Boddington's Bitter. Locals called it Bodies, not because of the alcohol content, but because of how it stood out. Dry, sharp, and unmistakably northern. The kind of pint that looked almost too pretty to drink. That signature foam? You'd stare at it longer than you'd like to admit before the first sip. It wasn't just beer, it was civic pride in a glass. To many Mancunians, Boddington's was the pint. Creamy, assertive, unapologetic. Outsiders found it strange. Locals defended it like a football club. And then came Ruddles County, a quieter contender maybe, but no less defiant. Brewed in Rutland, England's smallest county, it represented something different. Not mass appeal, but a kind of protest. A pint for those who wanted their beer real, fruity, strong, stubbornly traditional. Back when fizzy keg beer was creeping into every bar, Ruddles stood its ground. Ordering it meant something. It meant you weren't just drinking, you were choosing sides. You were backing tradition over convenience, flavor over flash. In a way, these 3 pints reflected the North itself. Bold, no nonsense, proud. Sometimes rough around the edges, but always full of character. They weren't premium. They didn't need gold labels or artisan branding. They just needed to be themselves, and that was more than enough. As we look back, it's easy to laugh at how serious people got about a pint. But in those days, a pub wasn't just a bar. It was a place to belong. And the beer you chose, that was part of your identity. If you've ever shared a pint that felt like more than a drink, that tasted like home or a memory, you're in the right place. Subscribe for more stories like this as we journey through Britain's most unforgettable brews and the people who drank them. When beer hit the airwaves, the golden age of pub marketing. By the early 1970s, something strange started happening in British pubs. Beer, once a local affair poured from hand pumps in dark corners, suddenly had catchphrases. It had jingles, it had swagger. And it wasn't just about taste anymore, it was about image. Enter the age of beer advertising. One name led the charge: Double Diamond. Its slogan, "A double diamond works wonders," wasn't just catchy, it was everywhere. Posters in bus stops, jingles on telly, pubs blasted it from their signage like a badge of honor. The beer itself, easygoing, golden, smooth. Not exactly memorable for flavor, but for many men in gray suits clocking off the 9 to 5, it became ritual. Was it good? That depends who you ask. Some say it was the perfect after-work pint. Others argue it was bland marketing in a glass. But the truth is, Double Diamond sold because it felt like something. It didn't just quench your thirst, it made you feel in on the joke, part of the club. But Double Diamond wasn't alone. Whitbread Trophy. Bitter followed with its cheeky campaign, "The pint that thinks it's a quart." The ads were silly. The pint? Even sillier. It wasn't loved or hated. It just was. Dependable. Steady. The kind of beer that never sparked an argument, but always showed up on the table. By the mid-70s, Whitbread had pubs scattered across Britain. You could walk into one, order a trophy, and know exactly what you were getting. No surprises, no fuss. For many, that was enough. But behind the friendly ads and smooth slogans, a quiet war was brewing. That war had a name: Worthington E. Now here was something different. This wasn't just beer, it was a statement. Cold, fizzy uniform. Worthington was the poster child for modernity. No regional quirks, no cellar mystery, just standardized keg convenience. To some it was refreshing. It poured fast, tasted crisp, and looked clean. But to others, especially traditionalists, it was an abomination. A plastic pint dressed in chrome. Yet it spread like wildfire. Bass marketed it aggressively, and by the late 60s, you couldn't walk into a pub without seeing that glowing Worthington badge behind the counter. For better or worse, it was the future. Or at least, it looked like it. But something was lost. The soul of the pint. The regional identity. The quirks that made beer personal. As marketing turned beer into a brand, many drinkers began to push back. And in that resistance, a new chapter of British beer culture began to form. One we'll explore soon. If you've ever wondered how beer became more about branding than brewing, Hit subscribe and stay with us. We've got more stories coming of rebellion, revival, and the drinkers who refused to forget what a real pint tasted like. And hey, if you remember that double diamond jingle, you're officially part of the club. The backlash begins. When keg killed character by the mid-1970s, something sacred was slipping through the cracks of the pub floorboards. Across Britain, pints were changing, not because of tradition or taste, but because of efficiency. Cold, carbonated, consistent. Keg beer had arrived with chrome taps, fizzy heads, and boardroom backing. But for many, it didn't feel like beer anymore. It was into this shift that Ruddles County reemerged, not just as a pint, but as a protest. Brewed in tiny Rutland, a county so small most maps forgot it, Ruddles became the rallying flag for real ale. Fruity, strong, and unmistakably alive, it didn't just satisfy the palate, it challenged the system. Ordering a Ruddles wasn't about flavor alone, it was about stance. It told the landlord and the world that you were still standing with tradition, that the hand-pulled pint, with all its inconsistencies, quirks, and personality, mattered more than a fizzy lager in a shiny glass. And then came the pint that pushed things too far. Watney's Red Barrel. It was the villain of the story, the beer everyone loved to hate. Originally promoted as the future, clean, reliable, and scientifically brewed, Red Barrel quickly became the symbol of everything wrong with modern beer. To critics, it tasted like carbonated cardboard. To defenders, well, even they struggled to explain the appeal beyond it was all there was. But here's the twist. Red Barrel wasn't just disliked, it was despised. With passion, with purpose. So much so, in fact, that in 1971, a group of drinkers founded CAMRA, Campaign for Real Ale, in a pub in northwest England. It wasn't just a club, it was a movement. They fought for flavor, for cask over keg, for tradition over trend. And suddenly beer wasn't just what filled your glass. It was what filled protest signs, pub conversations, and newspaper columns. This wasn't a minor blip in pub culture. This was a revolt. Suddenly beers like Skol Lager, flashy, fizzy, imported sounding, despite being brewed in Burton-on-Trent, were no longer simply seen as trendy. They were targeted, seen as symbols of marketing manipulation. Easy to drink, yes, but was that always a good thing? And while the ads shouted continental sophistication, the locals whispered, all image, no soul. Through all this, pub-goers didn't just complain, they organized. They published beer guides. They ranked pubs not by lighting or service, but by whether they poured a proper pint. The camera movement reminded the nation that beer was part of its cultural identity, not just a product. If this makes you want to lift a pint in quiet rebellion, you're not alone. Hit subscribe to join us as we trace the legacy of this beer revolution, the victories, the losses, and the survivors of that bold era. Because beer in Britain wasn't just a drink, it was personal. And if you ever drank a Red Barrel and pretended to enjoy it, you've got nothing to be ashamed of. We've all been there. Legacy and lessons, what we still carry from the golden era. You can't walk into a pub today and not feel it, even if just a trace. The shadow of the 60s and 70s still lingers in the air, like the last note of a jukebox tune that never quite left the room. But what really remains from that era of smoke-stained ceilings, dartboard rivalries, and pints pulled with pride? For one, the identity of beer. Back then, a pint wasn't chosen from a menu with flavor notes and alcohol percentages. It was instinctual. You drank what your father drank, what your mates ordered, what the pub poured. A bitter in Yorkshire tasted different from a bitter in London, and that difference mattered. It was regional. It was personal. Beers like Newcastle Brown Ale, once nicknamed Dog for the not-so-subtle excuse, "I'm going to see a man about a dog," carried more than alcohol. They carried pride. Sit down with one in the Northeast, and you weren't just having a drink. You were declaring belonging. Outsiders may have grimaced at the heavy, malty kick, but to locals, it was identity in a bottle. That kind of loyalty, hard to come by today. Another legacy, the jingles, the slogans, the sheer personality of these brews. A double diamond works wonders. The pint that thinks it's a quart. I bet he drinks Carling Black Label. They weren't just advertisements, they were cultural bookmarks. Shorthand for a time when beer wasn't just about taste, but about who you wanted to be. Ironically, some of these beers didn't survive. Others did, but only in name. Mass-produced, rebranded, repackaged for supermarket shelves. But for those who remember, the taste and memory is often more vivid than what's in the bottle today. And then there's Guinness. Yes, it's Irish, but by the 60s and 70s, it was everywhere in Britain. The slow pour, the black body, the creamy head that made you wait and watch. It wasn't for everyone, but for those who loved it, it became ritual. And somehow, even now, Guinness has retained that air of occasion. That moment where a pint means more than refreshment. Today, beer culture is bigger, broader, and in many ways better. We have options, craft revolutions, artisanal everything. But sometimes in a sleek bar serving IPAs with grapefruit notes, you find yourself missing a dodgy pint of Tetley's, a sticky table, and a regular who's had his seat since 1974. If this kind of nostalgia hits you just right, make sure to subscribe. There's plenty more to explore, from forgotten brews to modern revivals, and the people who've kept those pint-sized memories alive. Because beer isn't just brewed, it's passed on. The pint and the future, what's still brewing beyond the foam? So here we are, from Tetley's to Webster's, from the celebrated to the condemned, from pints pulled by hand to slogans piped through TV sets. We've traveled through a time when beer wasn't curated, it was lived. When the choice of pint said more about you than your job ever could. And now? Now the pub is different. The smoke is gone. The jukebox is digital. You can order a Belgian triple from a touchscreen menu next to a craft cider infused with elderflower. There are gluten-free lagers, lactose IPAs, and beers that taste like birthday cake. It's brilliant. It's bonkers. It's the future, but it begs the question, what have we kept? In some corners, old names still cling to taps like ghosts. You might spot a pint of John Smith's, still poured with northern pride, or Newcastle Brown Ale, still carrying the weight of its legacy, though perhaps brewed elsewhere now. Some beers were rebranded beyond recognition. Others were laid to rest, but the stories remain. Stories of a first legal pint, of stolen sips from Dad's glass, of the pub that smelled like history and sounded like home. Stories of protest, pride, poor decisions, and unforgettable nights. These pints weren't just beverages. They were bookmarks in people's lives. And maybe that's the real legacy, because when you ask someone about Watney's Red Barrel, they rarely talk about the taste. They talk about where they were, who they were with, what the jukebox played, what kind of world they were living in. And even now, if you sit long enough in any British pub, from the old school snug to the modern tap room, you'll hear echoes, the clink of glass, the grumble of the regular, the laugh too loud for the space it's in. Beer, it turns out, is less about ingredients than atmosphere. So maybe the story of British beer isn't really about hops, or bitterness levels, or keg versus cask. Maybe it's about memory. If that rings true for you, if you've ever tasted nostalgia in a pint, then this channel is for you. Subscribe and be part of the next chapter As we keep uncovering stories from the past, brewing new ones for the future, and sharing the culture, spirit, and stubborn heart of the great British pint. Because even if your favorite beer disappeared long ago, the feeling it gave you never really left. But then again, was that really the whole story? Or is there a forgotten pint still waiting in the cellar? A pub long closed but not quite silent? A taste you haven't remembered yet?